Hi, my name is Viola, and I've been interviewing my dad about his 1997 Everest summit climb. He went to Everest with the Nova team, and they actually filmed a documentary called Everest the Death Zone. And his team members included famous climbers like David Bershears and Ed Viesturs. Even though this was like 30 years ago, I'm a very curious person and I wanted to ask him questions about his climb. So I started this series called My Dad Climbed Everest and I Have Questions. It's originally made for TikTok, so that's the reason it's formatted the way it is, but I wanted to make these compilations on YouTube too, so that's what this is. And in today's video, we're talking about his first Everest climb when he went in 1991 and did not summit, and he talks about why he didn't summit and all the details there. He also talks about how on that climb he was actually a guide on Everest, which I think is super interesting, how you can be a guide there without having been there prior. Then he talks about his biggest obstacle of getting to Everest, having PTSD from his Everest summit climb and almost dying on that climb. And then some more fun topics like asking an astrologer about the day he summited Everest and like what that shows up as on his chart, and the parties at Everest Base Camp during and after his climb. So enjoy.
The 1991 climb was quite a learning experience for me. That was the first time I'd been to Nepal, and Nepal back in the 91 was completely different than how it is today. There weren't a lot of tourists in 1991. I was totally intimidated when I got off that plane in Kathmandu and looked around. A lot of people, it was kind of crazy back then. So I had a huge learning curve in 1991. I've said this a couple times, I was very intimidated to be there. And I was with Ed Viesturs and a guy named Robert Link, Steve Gall, and those three guys have already summited Everest. They climbed Everest the year before in the peace climb that included some Tibetans, Chinese, and Americans on the north side of Everest. And Ed summited on that one without supplementary oxygen. So I was kind of intimidated to be with those guys. And I was with my old climbing partner named Darren Goff. And so we were just kind of learning Darren and I were kind of learning as we kind of hiked into Everest Base Camp, what it was like to try to stay healthy, the new culture we were in, going on all these monasteries. It was an eye-opener. It was really cool. But it took a lot of energy because I think we were nervous. I was nervous. And we got to base camp, set up camp. I got pretty sick in the beginning of the climb. I had strep throat infection, real bad upper respiratory infection. It took me a few weeks to kind of recover from that, so I was kind of behind the 8 ball from the get-go. In 1991, I was still kind of learning how to pace myself in these big mountains, and I was not eating enough, was not getting enough calories in my system because I was kind of nauseated most of the time, and food didn't taste good. We ate a lot back in 91. We ate a lot of dalbut, boiled potatoes, ramen, things like that. So it was pretty bland, and it was actually pretty hard for me to eat that stuff. I had to force it down. So I was in a calorie deficit, and we moved up the mountain and set up high camps. I felt pretty good at the beginning of the climb, and but then as we were making our summit attempt, on the way up to Camp 3, I was having some altitude issues, kind of felt a little dizzy, just didn't feel right. Spent the night at Camp 3. This is in mid-May, after being on the mountain for probably about 8 weeks. Basically, I knew something was off in 91, and just because I was dizzy a lot, and I was concerned I was getting something like cerebral edema, and I was weak, and I pulled the cord there. I turned around. Ed Viesturs and Hall Wendell and Darren Goff went up to Camp 4, and on that particular climb in 1991, Ed was the only guy in that whole trip that summited in our group. It was challenging weather. We had a lot of wind. and our oxygen systems weren't really that great. Quite frankly, I was just fried, burned out, because I had not paced myself properly. And I also think that nervous energy took its toll too. So I didn't summit, and I was really disappointed. I remember walking out of base camp in '91 after putting all that effort into the climb and training and everything. I was really disappointed in myself. And I told myself that I was going to give it one more try at some point if I could get on the right team. And so I trained harder. I climbed a lot from 1991 to 1997 in the Pacific Northwest with Darren Goff. We did a lot of good routes, a lot of intense climbing. I was in pretty good shape, very good shape, I should say. Worked out all the time, took care of myself physically, mentally. And then I had that opportunity in '97. That was just a wonderful opportunity to go on that Nova climb and work with the Nova people, with Ed Viesters, Guy Cotter, and David Brashears, and Pete Athens, and Vega Guffinson. And these guys were all-star, and I was intimidated to be with these guys, but I also knew I was in good hands. What I did is, just like I did in '91, in '97, I watched what the good climbers did, what the guys that had already summited did, what they ate, how they walked, what they wore, their attitude, and I did exactly what those guys were doing, and that paid off. On these Everest climbs back then, most of the guides, the people that went on these trips with one or two clients were guides like on Rainier. There'd also be some senior guides that had already summited Everest. Like in '91, it was Steve Gall, Ed Viesters, and Robert Link. And then Darren and I were kind of the low guys on the totem pole. We had not summited Everest or never been to Nepal, as we talked about. And so we were kind of there to learn as much as we can, and probably do some of the grunt work. And possibly back then we would probably be the person to turn around if somebody had to go back down, because we just had low seniority, had low experience back then. As a guide in Everest in '91, basically it was to kind of look after the client, make sure they were doing eating right, wearing the right things, washing their hands. We'd also get in camp. On the trek in, we'd always sleep in tents back then, so we'd help set up camp. The Sherpas did most of the work, though. I got to hand it to those guys. I mean, they would do circles around us. So we were there just because for the experience. And then in '91, we also carry loads. We'd carry our personal gear through the ice fall, things like that. We were there to kind of help with the clients and give advice. My biggest obstacle in getting to Everest was basically just trying to get on with the right fit, the right team. That's what I was more concerned about than anything. I kind of knew I was going to go at some point, but the opportunity to go in 1991 and 1997, the people on those climbs, both those climbs I got along with, they're very accomplished climbers, and it was just a good fit from a personality standpoint. There were no big egos on those climbs, and we all got along all the time. It's a good question. I did have some nightmares and PTSD after the '97 trip. And because what I went through at Camp 3, and with Ed saving my life at Camp 3 with the Heimlich maneuver throughout the night, and getting ready to do a tracheotomy and all that, it was pretty stressful and pretty scary. I think it took me 3 or 4 years to kind of really be able to talk about that whole evening at Camp 3 without shedding a tear or showing a lot of emotion, and kind of work through it. And then I did have quite a bit of nightmares for a few years after that trip. I had like avalanche nightmares, things like that. So it did take me some time to kind of to work through what had happened, and kind of put it in the back of my mind. In 1997, there was 2 big parties at our base camp. in the beginning of the climb, there was this British climber there named Mal Duff, and he passed away at base camp when we were there. And he is a famous climber, a British guy, and he was leading a climb up there, but he passed away. And so a lot of guys, there was a big party in his honor after he died there in '97. And a lot of guys were overserved in beer and chang. And I do remember that I did not participate at all in that one because I was doing everything I can just to hang on and didn't want to hurt myself with being hung over the next day. So that was a pretty big party, a lot of music, a lot of dancing, and it was in our tent. I remember that. Then after we came back down in '97 from the summit, I think we were all just so exhausted, especially from, with Ed, Guy Cotter, and Pete, and those guys trying to keep me alive, my issue I had up on the upper mountain. So I think everybody was exhausted. I don't remember a big party. I do remember having a beer at base camp and maybe a shot of Chang, and ate dinner that night. And I just went to bed. I remember I was so tired, I just couldn't function. And I think everybody was exhausted. So I don't remember a big party. There are usually parties at individual camps up there for the individual teams, but the big parties really occur on the trek down to Lukla. And usually the biggest party is in Namche Bazaar, which is at 11,300 feet. One of the lodges, you go in there and you have dinner and you have a good party and a few beers and stuff. And a lot of those lodges have nice little bars in them where you can get mixed drinks and things like that. But I do remember coming down in 1991 and having a pretty big party at Namche Bazaar and having a few too many beers and stuff. And I was kind of hungover the next day for the trek down to Lukla. A few weeks ago, I did talk to an astrologer that was kind of looking over my astrology and important dates in my life. I asked him about May 23rd, 1997, and he went back, and he said, oh. He goes, that's a very important date for you. And I told him that I'd summited Everest on that day and almost died. And he said that date, the gods were basically looking after me, and it was an important date. He could tell on the astrology. He said that you could tell that I was surrounded by good people based on my astrology. He also said that my throat, based on the astrology reading, was going to be a weakness for me, and obviously it was, because that's where my blockage was, where I couldn't breathe.